is Channel Islands Restoration? We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We're a habitat restoration contractor. We do environmental consulting, and we do environmental education, which is what we're doing tonight. Speaking of tonight, we're going to hear about hidden meadows, understanding seagrass ecosystems in the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary. We'll be hearing from Lizzie Duncan. She is with the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary. She is a dedicated research ecologist at the sanctuary, initially joining the team in 2017 as a California Sea Grant Fellow. Her work at the sanctuary began with providing project field support as a scientific diver and exploring data for characterizing sanctuary visitation. As a federal employee since 2020, Lizzie's expertise extends to deep sea ecosystem exploration and characterization using remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, alongside revitalizing a community-involved long-term eelgrass monitoring program. She also continues to support dive operations as a NOAA dive master. This map shows the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary. I'm honored to be the secretary of the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary's Advisory Council. So I am aware of some of this work, and it's great stuff. So glad that you could join us tonight. I hope you have plenty of questions for Lizzie. And if you do, please put them in the Q&A section, not in the chat. The Q&A section of Zoom, and we will curate them and ask them at the end of the webinar. So feel free to type them in, and it's always interesting to hear feedback and questions from the public. This webinar will be available on our website at cirweb.org/webinars, as are all of our webinars that we've been doing for the last few years. I do want to take the time to acknowledge that the land upon which our restoration work is completed is the unceded territory of the Chumash people. We pay our respects to the Chumash elders, past, present, and future, for they hold the memories, traditions, and culture of this land we work to protect. So with that, I will stop sharing, and we will turn over to Lizzie to give us her presentation.
Thank you. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining me tonight. As Ken mentioned, I'll be talking to you today about some of the eelgrass work that we've been doing in the sanctuary, but I first wanted to give a little bit more information about myself. As a research ecologist for the sanctuary, I like to ask questions about the relationships between organisms, as well as the relationships between organisms and their environment. And so why are organisms or habitats where they are? And what does that mean for us, and where can we predict that they're going to be in the future with a changing environment? And with my job at the sanctuary, I get to continue asking those questions across a variety of habitat types in the marine environment, from the intertidal to deep sea corals and sponges, and now on to seagrass. So as your research ecologist for the evening, I thought I'd give you a short overview of what we'll be covering. I'll go over a little bit about the National Marine Sanctuary Program, as well as the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, our home sanctuary. And the main topic of their conversation is seagrass. What is it? Why is it important? If you've never heard about it, why should we care about it? And how the sanctuary is going about monitoring it from the past all the way to the present. And I'll be sharing with you a little bit about what we've learned so far and what steps we hope to take next to continue this important work. So the National Marine Sanctuary System is a part of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. We have 18 underwater parks that we manage across the nation, from Great Lakes waters all the way to remote Pacific islands. And there are 6 national marine sanctuaries here on the West Coast in the California Current Large Marine Ecosystem. The Channel Islands Sanctuary is the one furthest south here in Southern California. And we have a variety of jobs. So sanctuary staff are busy working every day, collaborating on scientific projects with partners, conservation initiatives, research and monitoring events, education and outreach, community engagement, and responsible recreation, as well as cooperative resource management issues. And so for our Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, our boundaries encompass a number of really amazing, diverse ecosystems, from the surface, like seabirds, plankton, and whales, all the way to the deep sea beyond where light reaches, where deep sea corals, sponges, and fish live on the seafloor. And so within our boundaries, which are high tide all the way out to 6 nautical miles, we also have a number of MPAs within our boundaries that are managed by the state within state waters, and then federally co-managed within the federal portion of the waters. National marine sanctuaries typically do not regulate fishing. That's not within our congressional mandate. We are a complementary type of marine protected area with that of like no-take marine reserves, for example. So sanctuaries prohibit and regulate things like seabed construction, so to prevent seabed disturbance, from construction, oil and gas exploration and extraction, to ocean dumping and all similar things of that nature, including research. We permit research within our boundaries as well. So within the number of different habitat types we have within the sanctuary, one of them that has gotten relatively less attention than others, say as our iconic kelp forests and intertidal rocky shores, I think are seagrass ecosystems. So what is seagrass? Why is it cool? Why am I talking to you about it tonight? Well, one cool thing about it is it's the only true flowering plant that completes the entirety of its life cycle within the marine environment. So very similar to terrestrial plants, they have a root system, leaves, and they have flowers, as well as, and they can reproduce with seeds. They grow in the soft sediment of the sanctuary and can form meadows or beds depending on how extensive they get. And on the right-hand side, that is an example, a photo of seeds developing in a sheath. There are 2 main species that we commonly encounter on the West Coast, both of the genus Zostera. Marina typically stays within closed protected bays and estuaries, while Pacifica, which is what I'm mostly going to be talking to you about tonight, tends to inhabit open coast systems that are less well protected by the mouth of estuaries, for example, and bays. And so a lot of the Zostera pacifica beds can actually extend much deeper because the water clarity can be better offshore, particularly within the sanctuary, that's true. And they can extend for larger areas. But there's been more research and focused on Zostera marina within the closed basin estuaries for a number of reasons. One of them being easier access. If they're along the mainland and they're exposed during low tide, for example, at Morro Bay there, the National Estuary Program, you can see at low tide that they're exposed. So if you wanted to map it or go do some field work, you could do that without maybe necessarily a ton of specialized equipment. However, when we're studying offshore eelgrass, Zostera pacifica, we probably need scuba. Aerial satellite imagery may not be as good or as reliable as it would be for something that you could see at low tide, for example. And a lot of the research that's been done in general on eelgrass within California and across the nation has really been a result or a focus on mitigation projects. Eelgrass is protected across the US and within California by the Clean Water Act, as well as the Magnuson-Stevens Conservation and Management Act. And so there's a California eelgrass mitigation policy that says, depending on the activity, if there is an unavoidable impact to eelgrass based on the activity that you're doing, it requires mitigation efforts or enhancing or outplanting habitat to make up for the impacts that you've that have resulted from that activity. And so there's more information generally about Marina than there is Pacifica, but even across species, they provide a number of ecosystem services, which is why they're protected and why NOAA has them classified as an essential fish habitat. So I'll go over a few of the ecosystem services with you so we can all get on the same page of why they're cool and why they're important. The first one being one of the benefits of eelgrass beds is they can help prevent erosion of coastal and shoreline ecosystems and sandy beaches. They can, with their rhizomes and their root systems, they really bind the sediment to keep themselves in place, which also keeps that sediment in place. And their complex structures of their leaves, they can grow to be a meter or so long or longer. That tends to slow wave action and slow water motion. And so they can trap additional particles within their sediment and protect beaches and shorelines from strong currents and waves from storms and other weather events. They can also help mitigate or ameliorate some impacts of climate change locally as well as globally. Eelgrass beds absorb carbon dioxide that is dissolved in the water column as they uptake that to photosynthesize. And so not only are they incorporating carbon from their environment, as they age and start to decay, a lot of that organic matter tends to get trapped within their rhizome and root system. And so it captures that carbon and then it keeps it there. So it keeps it from re-entering the system. And when they photosynthesize, they are increasing the local pH. So for some organisms that might be in their larval stage, for example, they could be providing like a micro environment that benefits some of these species that might be more vulnerable to acidic conditions that are a result of climate change. They also provide habitat to a number of species that we care about. So based on their root system, as well as their really long leaves, they provide complex 3D structure that other fish and invertebrates can use as habitat. So for juveniles, they can provide an opportunity for foraging. They tend to be in shallow protected bays, which means the water that they inhabit tend to be warmer, where they can grow faster and hopefully get to that next life stage where their chances of mortality hopefully decrease. Other bigger animals can come in and forage on the juveniles. Blades can be used for reproductive purposes, like, for example, attaching egg sacs of mollusks. And so in addition to foraging, reproduction, protection from predation, as well as the opportunity for foraging, these habitats just increase the general biodiversity of the local ecosystems because of the 3D complex habitat that they provide. In addition, similar to how they function in terms of protecting coastal bays and estuaries from erosion, that can also benefit water quality and clarity. So as they slow the motion from those waves and solids and particulates can fall out of the water column and get trapped in their roots, that improves water clarity. And they can absorb nutrients in the water too, which can help prevent an overabundance of nutrients that could cause harmful algal blooms, which can cause a number of cascading effects within the ecosystem, including reduced oxygen availability for other organisms, as well as decreased light availability for the eelgrass itself. And again, similar to how it provides habitat, there's generally more biodiversity in areas with eelgrass habitat. They support hundreds of ecologically and economically important species, from endangered and threatened species to those that we like to catch, that we like to look at, which means that eelgrass habitats also supports thriving economies, local and national and global. So as they help produce fish biomass and production, that means there's more fish to catch. It provides recreational opportunities for those that like to fish recreationally, for fish and shellfish. And it supports the general well-being and the protecting of coastal areas through the protection of through erosion, climate change, habitat, and so on and so forth. And so because it offers all of these services to both the environment as well as benefits to humans, the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, as well as other agencies, are interested in where is eelgrass habitat, how is it doing, do we need to intervene, especially with a lot of the pressures that get exerted on such these habitats. So how do we study eelgrass within the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary? Well, luckily, a lot of our foundational knowledge came from a long-term monitoring program that began in the early 1980s by the Channel Islands Research Program. So research rock stars like Jack Engel, Kathy Ann Miller, Jesse Allstat were really foundational in gathering a lot of the baseline knowledge of where eelgrass habitats are, the extent, and then how much they vary through time, because many of these beds were revisited on an annual basis. And so they were able to record really interesting observations from biological pressures like increases in the predatory white urchin, they like to feed on eelgrass, to, for example, in 1991, the disappearance of eelgrass presence from Frenchies, which is on the north side of Anacapa, as well as the disappearance of eelgrass from Little Scorpion, which is on the southeast side of the Scorpion anchorage. And so as funding and human resources change throughout time, administrations, and so on and so forth, some of these projects waned as support waned naturally. And there have been other projects that have provided information and data to help us understand where eelgrass is and how it's doing. For example, in 2015, NOAA Fisheries supported side scan sonar mapping of eelgrass beds around Santa Cruz Island, as well as several along the mainland. And so we got some really high resolution maps of eelgrass beds in that time. But otherwise, other ways of getting at eelgrass bed extent, like snorkeling or scuba diving, is how we have a lot of information for the other beds that fisheries didn't happen to map. And in recent years, the sanctuary has gone through a number of exercises such as vulnerability assessments to understand how do our resources change? Are they at risk from certain pressures, and how are those pressures changing? And eelgrass was a highlight as being very important and very vulnerable to environmental change and human pressures. And around the same time, we joined a steering committee for the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project, because they're also interested in doing bite-wide, so all of Southern California-wide monitoring of eelgrass habitats. So we have an idea of how individual beds are doing within the broader context of the region. So in 2024, we began to try to reinvigorate some of this work, my colleagues and I, by leveraging ship time, existing ship time and diver resources to just get out there and start putting eyes back on those beds after consulting with folks like Jack Engel and Jesse Allstat. But we're a pretty small team. And those eelgrass beds are pretty darn big. So in terms of what kind of tools and data sets we can use to help us answer these questions about where are they and how are they doing, scuba and snorkel is really the best way to get out there and see it for yourself, but it covers a really small spatial scale. And so we can do some mapping, limited again by boat time, because we have to get offshore to the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary. So although that has some of the finest resolution information we can gather, it's also some of the most costly. We've been working with partners that have innovative technology, so remotely operated vehicles as well as autonomous underwater vehicles that can go out and be programmed to do some mapping to save dive time and those types of things. So we've been dabbling in some of that innovative tech, which I'll share with you about today. There's also the mapping, like I mentioned, acoustic mapping that can help us see the bottom of the seafloor without having to see it with our eyes, as well as satellite imagery, which comes with its pros and cons as well. So we can kind of try to piece information gathered by all these various tools together to give us a better picture of what's going on in the sanctuary as well as along the mainland. And so that was a lot of talking, and now I'm hoping we'll have some cool pictures to look at. I'm going to show you a series of satellite images that we've gathered and explored just this recent week or two. And so some of this is still being processed computationally, personally, but we're seeing some changes, which I think is really interesting and important to note and to share with the community. And so I'll be showing you satellite images of Smuggler's Cove. We'll start here on the east side of Santa Cruz Island. It's a big, calm, protected cove. There's no piers or campgrounds in this particular area, but it is a popular anchorage location. Eelgrass really likes the same kinds of conditions and habitats that humans do in terms of where they like to recreate and anchor for overnight. And so we have satellite images from a number of years leading up to the present. Satellite images have pros and cons, like I mentioned. A number of variables have to line up just the right way in order to get a really good satellite image of something below the surface of the water. And so water clarity has to be decent. Probably can't acquire some of these satellite images straight after a big rain or a lot of wind or swell. There has to be minimal cloud cover, and the sun and the satellite have to be at the right angle so there's no glare. And so based on filtering what we can actually use from satellite images taken many times throughout and over a year, we have some images that were good enough to pull from 2013, 14, 15, and 2018. And I have here, this is a bird's eye view of Smuggler's Cove. And that little blue dot is the US Coast Guard mooring buoy. And so I've highlighted that so you can kind of see through the years where eelgrass is in relation to the buoy, as well as kind of the size that we're seeing in terms of the aerial extent. And so starting off in November of 2013, we see that on the shallow side, which is the northwest side, that there's some kind of straggly looking patches, but on the deeper end, the deeper side, the southeast, it looks pretty dense. When we go to just look at January 2014, it looks like a lot of that eelgrass maybe has grown back and it's more dense and kind of fills in that shallow area again. In February 2015, it's starting to look straggly again. Still nice and dense as far as we can tell through the satellite imagery on the deeper side. And then fast forward to 2018, because we didn't get a lot of good imagery in between 2015 and 2018, it appears based on this imagery that a lot of that shallow edge that had at least been ephemeral at some point is no longer there. And based on images from 2020 as well that weren't quite as pretty enough to include in this presentation, we see a similar shape and pattern. So we are seeing some amount of seasonality with some of these images, but maybe also an overall trend of decline through the years. But that's why we need to take multiple tools into consideration when we're looking at this type of habitat and information. So I also want to take you to Prisoners Harbor to show you another example and some of the data that we've gathered recently in the last few years. This image is from 2002. This is from the north side of central Santa Cruz. And there's usually a permanent pier here, but this happens to be a rare image, which you can see it was a great water clarity day, a lot of eelgrass there. But there is no pier in this particular image here. But these are the types of days we hope for when we want to look at satellite imagery. And the first couple of images I have are actually from Google Earth. These are publicly available. You can go in and look at historical archived imagery through time and any place that you're interested, your neighborhood or a national park, for example. And again, here I have in that little blue dot, I have highlighted the National Park maintained mooring buoy for the Ferry Island packers, as well as their vessels when they need to come out to the park to do park things. So we can see generally there's the darker part of the image looks like eelgrass, and we have side scan sonar mapping from 2015 as well that matches really well with this to say that actually the satellite image is doing a pretty good job of representing what the eelgrass was at that moment in time. And if you squint really hard, you can also probably notice that around that blue dot, there are some scars, and what around that blue dot is likely from the mooring anchor or the tackle that keeps that mooring buoy afloat for vessels to hook up to, which means they don't have to anchor in the eelgrass. They can use that mooring can, island packers, for example. So I pulled this imagery within recent weeks, and we have visited prisoners to do snorkel and scuba surveys, as well as drop camera missions, AUV, and ROV work as well. And in October of 2024, we conducted a structural analysis, so transects quadrats of prisoners' harbor to look at bed density, patchiness, and so on. And we also had someone snorkel and map with a GPS the outer portion, the extent of the bed as best they could. And so when we're thinking about the types of data that we have and how much can we trust or really rely on a snorkeler depending on the visibility, we could be missing patches, so on and so forth. So I didn't think too much of this extent, for example, that we have outlined here until I also pulled just a few days ago the satellite imagery from 2024 of August from Worldview Satellite 2. This one, again, is from Maxar. The previous images were from Google Earth. And when we overlay them together, they match pretty darn well. So I have a lot more confidence in what maybe snorkeling and satellite imagery can tell us together. In addition, this isn't the most comprehensive or exhaustive way to look or find eelgrass. So scan sonar mapping would be maybe a better choice, because then that doesn't depend on water clarity. But this gives us pretty good confidence that this is what the eelgrass bed is looking like in the last year or two, which is a pretty dramatic difference. It also appears that there's eelgrass on the east side of the pier, but we had focused on the west side to do our snorkel surveys and our scuba surveys. So those images, the track line and the image happened within a few months of each other. So it's nice. It feels good when they map up like you would hope and expect. And just a few images and observations from our dive surveys. We noticed in and around the mooring buoy area within the circumference of where the chain can drag at low tide, that some of the eelgrass, it was patchy, but it was present. And some of it was kind of tattered, potentially from physical disturbance from the chain. The eelgrass blades tended to be a little bit shorter, and their tips tended to be a little ragged, but that wasn't necessarily true for the rest of the eelgrass bed outside of the circumference of the mooring tackle. And I will say we did also notice an invasive species on the shallow side of prisoners. We saw Undaria there, which is the wakame. And so that's just something that we've noted and to keep tabs on as we continue to go back. So why might we be seeing these changes? There's definitely some natural variation in eelgrass beds, but there's also some pretty strong stressors and pressures on eelgrass habitats that could also be combining in terms of what might be driving these changes. So eelgrass is sensitive habitat to a number of different stressors and disturbances, from increased turbidity because they rely on sunlight to photosynthesize. Biologically, they're also susceptible to a wasting disease that is a type of slime mold, I believe. And as we spoke of on the right-hand side, this is an example of an image from Richardson Bay up in the Bay Area and a really good aerial satellite image of anchoring scars from vessels that are anchoring overnight in the eelgrass bed. So they are subject to disturbance from anchoring as well as mooring tackle. And generally, there's a lot of different events that can happen that can potentially impact an eelgrass bed, from increased runoff from storms. A lot of wave activity with storm surge can rip up eelgrass beds. Elevated water temperature, like from the warm water blob that we had in 2015 and 2016. Harmful algal blooms, contaminants, oil spills, any sort of construction from dredging to construction, development, coastline development, sea level rise, as well as introduced species like the Undaria we mentioned. And on the image on the left, that is Caulerpa, which luckily that has pretty much only been found on the mainland in some eelgrass habitats, like in the San Diego Bay and Newport. So we're trained to find it, our sanctuary scientists, and so hopefully we won't find it, but that has not been noted at the Channel Islands Sanctuary, and we hope it stays that way. In terms of considering some threats to eelgrass habitat, water clarity can definitely be an issue. Like I said, we had a lot of rain the last few winters, not this very last winter, but a lot of runoff and sediment inflow into bays and estuaries like those in Smugglers and Prisoners can cause poor water visibility, and therefore just less sunlight can come and for eelgrass to use to grow. There's also anchoring. We have an example from scorpion anchorage, for example, where we found an anchor that was an active anchor in an eelgrass bed. But we're also looking at other types of data sources that we might be able to use to look at trends through time. And one of those is AIS data. So there are ships that elect to carry AIS information transponders. So they submit they transmit their location every few minutes over time. And so this is a map of data, some data from 2024, looking at how often or how long ships were transmitting AIS information while not moving very far. Not moving very far or very fast. So kind of filtering it for anchoring. And so we see there is a lot of anchoring, as we already knew, in Smuggler's Cove. So maybe if we have more information and data through time, we can see, are the pressures and stressors that maybe humans are putting on eelgrass beds, are those changing or worsening through time, to kind of help fluff out some more of this information of what might be driving these changes. So generally, to go over what we've learned, regular and comprehensive monitoring is sorely needed, not just in the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, but all throughout California and the mainland. We just need better and more consistent information on where the eelgrass is, how it's doing, the environmental conditions it relies upon to do well, and just pretty much more information. We observed, while we were doing our snorkel and scuba surveys, evidence of anchoring and mooring disturbance at more than one site. But we still saw lots of big fish, seemingly healthy eelgrass ecosystems, dense, very green, not a lot of epiphytes. Of course, we did see what we think are declines in beds at certain sites. But we also saw bed reestablishment at Little Scorpion. So based on some information we gathered from a community member, someone that likes to spearfish and scuba dive, said, hey, you guys should check out Little Scorpion. That's where I go when I fish for, XYZ. And so we went over there, and despite having seen it, the last record having no eelgrass at Little Scorpion, we were able to find a bed. And so that's really exciting, that even though maybe some beds are leaving, maybe some beds are coming back. And we've also been to the northern Anacapa area where restoration had occurred in 2002. And that eelgrass is persistent and going strong in the State Marine Reserve. And there are patches in the adjacent conservation area as well. So there's definitely still eelgrass out there. Sometimes it's not where we hope or expecting it, but we found it in other places that maybe we weren't expecting to find it. And based on our small team and the types of information we have, this is really just emphasized to a lot of us that we need more comprehensive and intentional monitoring of these types of habitats. So now that we know what we know, what do we want to do next? How do we proceed with this information? Some of it good, some of it potentially alarming. And we're working together to build a framework that we can use going forward to build partnerships, capacity, and just build project longevity into studying blue carbon ecosystems like seagrass habitats. So basically, we really want to understand the basic science, the management needs, as well as the user needs, in terms of who uses eelgrass beds, who benefits from them, what are their values and thoughts and perspectives. So we need some really basic information from mapping to understanding the conditions they depend on, identifying additional pressures and knowledge gaps, such as connectivity or the genetics of the various beds around the islands and the mainland. And depending on what we're seeing, explore ideas and options for potential restoration solutions and methods that are appropriate for offshore, very large eelgrass ecosystems. And to do this simultaneously, we want to build partnerships and cultivate a collaborative approach. We are one agency with a small team, and so there are many people that go out there to recreate, that are part of tourism operations, that can potentially be a part of this effort to learn more and to implement, strategies to help us preserve this type of ecosystem into the future. So we want to build capacity and project support through the community and through looking for various funding sources that can help support this work. And we really want to co-design and implement a community-backed, data-driven management framework that can help us really target solutions-oriented management applications in ways that can balance both human use and conservation in the long term. So in the meantime, in the most immediate, we're going to continue to explore the various data sets that we can. There's more information to be mined from those satellite images. AIS data, for example, there are ways to engage the community and gain knowledge from local knowledge holders. We can continue exploring innovative solutions like using automated tech to do some mapping so we're not using as many human resources and it's more efficient and they don't get seasick. And we want to continue to engage interested communities like our Sanctuary Advisory Council. So we've given a couple of presentations about trying to reinvigorate this work and some of our preliminary findings. And we're going to continue to do so and try to network and see who's interested in working with us and partnering with us and applying for different funding opportunities and getting out there and learning about what our sanctuary has with respect to eelgrass resources. So with that, I just want to say thank you for listening. And I want to thank a ton of our partners. Many of them have been scattered throughout the slides in terms of photo credits, but POWA Marine Research Group, they've gone out with us and are doing a lot of really great eelgrass restoration work on Catalina Island. The National Park Service we're working with in terms of looking at potentially upgrading mooring tackle, co-located with sensitive eelgrass habitat, National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, Cal State Long Beach, Dr. Christine Whitcraft, Aquarium of the Pacific, as well as Ocean Oranges and Real Guppies Outdoors. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions you might have. And thanks for listening.
Okay, thank you. Wonderful presentation. We do have several questions. And first off, the question about the common names, eelgrass and seagrass, are they essentially the same common name?
I actually Googled this because I wasn't sure before this presentation, and I'm so glad I did. So all eelgrass is seagrass, but not all seagrass is eelgrass. But I think that just depends on the species and the taxonomy of it. I think there are some seagrasses that aren't maybe completely submerged, but I'm not 100% sure. I think eelgrass is a type of seagrass, I think is the best, most concise answer I can give.
Okay. Leanne, Lindsay basically asked, considering everything that's going on in the federal government these days, how will those within NOAA actually protect such critically important seagrass/eelgrass from being devastated by any oil and mineral extraction programs that are being that are under consideration and trying to get launched along the California coast?
That is an excellent question. Thank you for asking that. We are doing our best with the team that we have. With respect to sanctuaries in particular, we lost 25% of our staff this year, and we're not entirely sure what the new fiscal year will bring us, but we are reorganizing. We are, doing more with less, but it's I think that's part of one of the reasons we want to design such a collaborative scientific process, especially with respect to eelgrass as we get this going again, is because we can help build capacity in our partners through collaborations. You know, it doesn't have to be us that's out there doing the snorkeling and the diving. There are other opportunities and organizations that can use that as learning and professional development opportunities, students, other nonprofits. And as far as protecting it from potential mineral extraction and drilling, we have mandates through the National Marine Sanctuary Act that protect what is within our boundaries from activities such as those. So that would require, you know, a whole process if it were to something like that were to be permitted. But we've not, as far as I'm aware, none of that has been put on the table yet. I don't anticipate that in the near future, but happy to talk more if you have further questions.
Okay. And then Tamara Mason wondered about your Smuggler's Cove satellite image. Wasn't able to quite see where the eelgrass was. She says she can see color variation, but does not know which is eelgrass versus sand and rock, etc. Do you mind looking at that and pointing it out?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Let's see. Okay. So my apologies. So Smuggler's Cove is, the vast majority of it is sand, with the exception of this like little tail here that is hard substrate. And pretty much this entire shadow right here around the Coast Guard mooring buoy is eelgrass. And so kind of comparing, this is the mooring here in blue, comparing where the shallow edge is, if this is shore, kind of comparing where this edge is by the mooring can versus 2014 extends beyond the mooring can in a pretty definitive and dense way. And then in 2015, we can kind of see that transition happening again where it's less dense and maybe that edge is more along the mooring can buoy right here. And then in 2018, for this particular image, we don't necessarily see even not very dense patches of eelgrass extending shallower of the mooring buoy here. So my apologies, I should have highlighted that better, but thank you for asking that. So you and other people who maybe couldn't see it could get a better idea of those images and what they were showing.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. John Bricks asks, is anchoring allowed around the blue mooring at prisoners? And just in general, how, another question was, what kind of damage does mooring do to eelgrass?
Yeah, anchoring is not prohibited in smugglers or prisoners. It's being a soft bottom habitat, that's usually where people like to anchor up for the night or like to fish and recreate, like I said. The question about the mooring, I'll answer first. Mooring cans can be designed to be an alternative to anchoring because there's one point of attachment and many vessels can come and use it. The mooring buoy in smugglers is specifically owned and maintained by the U.S. Coast Guard, so that is for Coast Guard ships only. And the mooring buoys in prisoners and Scorpion, for example, those are maintained by the park, and those are for use by park vessels as well as island packers only. So they're not necessarily for public use. And so having a mooring in a habitat like eelgrass means when they visit and they come to these areas, they don't have to anchor over and over again. They can just attach to the mooring buoy and they're not impacting the bottom at all. The damage from mooring tackle comes from the chain that attaches the big float to the surface to the anchor at the bottom. There has to be so much chain slack in order to accommodate the changing sea level of the tides. And so we can have plus or minus between a really high and a really low 7 to 10 feet difference. And so at a really low tide, the damage comes from the heavy chain kind of dragging around in that circumference. So the damage is limited to the, where the chain can touch around the anchor within that circumference. But there are alternatives that the park we've discussed talk about potentially upgrading to floating lines. So maybe that's even less of an issue. And as far as anchoring, the damage, is just, the physical disturbance of the anchor laying on top of the eelgrass, and then to really hold the anchor digs into the sediment, which can uproot some of those shoots. And so anchoring is allowed there. There's no restrictions presently within the sanctuary for anchoring.
Okay. Let's see what else we got here. Leanne also asks, how much of a concern are green crabs on eelgrass / seagrass?
Green crabs. I'm not sure if that's a West Coast species. If it is, I'm not particularly aware of it. I don't think it is. The main biological threats or predators potentially that we would consider in eelgrass would be the white urchin, Lidochinus. They feed on eelgrass, so that would be a very similar pressure from green crabs on their local eelgrass beds. White urchins can impose the same sort of pressure, as well as not predation, but brittle stars. When they come in, they can come in those really thick mats, and they can kind of smother areas if there's a warm water event or something that just kind of like a harmful algal bloom. They're hard to predict. But if a bunch of them in a boom and bust cycle were to come and either eat all of the eelgrass or smother all of the eelgrass, that can impact in a pretty big way in a short amount of time the health and status of eelgrass beds in the sanctuary.
John Bricks also asked, can the seeds be harvested and dispersed?
I believe so. There are in terms of restoration, once we determine that that's appropriate and we're consulting and working with the right people to do restoration activities, there are existing studies and efforts across the world that we can look to leverage their knowledge and their best practices. I believe seed harvesting and planting is one strategy that actually might be well suited for very large areas like the Channel Islands Sanctuary, where the eelgrass beds can go on for thousands of kilometers, hundreds of kilometers, excuse me. So seeding could potentially be a solution, but there are some cons with that. With water movement before eelgrass is established, there tends to be stronger currents and wave action. So until they really get established, it might be easier for them to get ripped up. But I feel like that's still something we want to consider if we decide to move forward with some sort of restoration effort moving forward.
So yeah, related to that, Megan Cleveland asked if there were any restoration projects conducted in the sanctuary and around the islands.
Yes, in 2002, after the loss of eelgrass at Anacapa, the north side of Anacapa, Jesse Allstat, the Channel Islands Research Program, they did a huge outplanting of eelgrass transplanted from sites along Santa Cruz Island, and they had mixed success in the beginning while the eelgrass was establishing and creating their network of rhizomes because of the white urchins, as well as being smothered by brittle stars at some point while they were little and not established yet. But that's 10 years later has been a big success. So where they outplanted kind of seeded along that current along the north side of Anacapa, from the west all the way to the east side, there is a lot more eelgrass north of Anacapa now. So some of these restoration efforts that we've been learning about, success for a short-term project could be like, what's your success metric for a year or two worth of like grant funding, for example. But I think we're finding that because of the stochasticity and the uncertainty in the environment, that it can really take a lot longer than just a few years to really have eelgrass beds establish strongly and persistently to be eel to determine something like success. But Anacapa, the north side of Anacapa and Frenchies, is a pretty wonderful shining example of success, restoration success.
Great. Well, we have time for just a few more. Samantha Hickson asks, where can we find opportunities for assisting with scuba surveys of eelgrass forests?
I can go back to my email address if you want to email me at lizzie.duncan@noaa.gov. We're gathering interest and engaging the community and trying to build out a potential program in the future that would require some funding support. But I think, yeah, just getting a list of people who are interested is the first step. So it'd be great if you could reach out to us and let us know, and we'll keep you in mind as things develop.
And that email address is a good opportunity for people who had kind of long commentary in the Q&A that I'm not able to get to reading yet. If you want to communicate directly then with Lizzie, then that's a good opportunity to do so. There's her email address.
Yes, please.
Leanne Lindsay also asked, what about trawling, scraping the bottom? In other words, what kind of problems does trawling cause for eelgrass?
Yeah, that's another good question. As someone who's also worked in the deep sea coral habitat and understanding where trawling is happening now versus in the past, there is no trawling generally, mostly in Southern California. It's kind of like a habitat. Oh gosh, I forget. It's a fisheries term for the protection, but trawling is mostly prohibited except beyond certain depths and for certain fisheries like prawns, for example, and that happens mostly along the shelf. So there's really not any trawling happening in the sanctuary, luckily, or usually at depths that shallow unless they're permitted for research. But trawling would absolutely just gobble up all the eelgrass in its wake. That's a pretty damaging form of fishing. But luckily that's not something we're presently dealing with. But in context of like what happens with deep sea corals, for example, sometimes the environment can be changed in such a fundamental way things don't recover. But I'm not as familiar or aware of the trawling pressure that happened before NOAA Fisheries came in and put in some of these protections against trawling. So there's a possibility that trawling in many years past has impacted the distribution and extent of eelgrass that we wouldn't necessarily be able to trace back.
Okay. Brian Kessler wonders at what depth is the seagrass/eelgrass beds located?
Great question. So they're limited on their shallower edge by wave action because they can get ripped out at low tide or if there's storm surge, for example. And so I don't think they're found in the Channel Islands much shallower than 20 or so feet, maybe 15, depending on if it's really protected, but it varies by site. And they can actually get pretty deep because the water clarity tends to be better offshore at the Channel Islands, and the currents can help bring nutrients to the eelgrass bed. So they have been found historically as deep as 60 plus feet. So the shores can be so gradually sloping that they just go on for kilometers. Great question.
Yes, it is. Melinda Fay asks, do you find wasting disease to be progressive? Meaning where you find it, does it only get worse or can the beds recover? Do you have a sense of how it's caused? Some sort of environmental pressure?
That's an excellent question I don't have the answer for as someone who's still new to this landscape. We haven't seen it preliminarily through our reconnaissance scuba surveys to the point where we've had to like stop and say, okay, we need to figure this out before we move any further. So we've not necessarily seen it. It can also be hard to distinguish between grazer scars, like snail epiphyte scars. So that's definitely one of our science needs and our questions that we would want to have addressed before moving forward with anything like restoration, because we don't know much. I personally don't know much about it yet, but I know there are people out there that are, and those would be excellent partners.
Okay, Kayla Goronimo asks, rather than presence/absence, are there any other methods to quantify the health of eelgrass communities?
Yes, definitely. That's where the scuba surveys come in, as well as something like side scan sonar mapping. That can give you an idea of the density or shoot height. But that is, for scuba, is so much more labor intensive. And so with the information we're getting from our scuba surveys, we're looking at things like shoot density, percent cover, shoot length. Some research groups focus on shoot width as well. And that can give us an idea of the health and the structure and how that translates to function. So maybe we have a bed and we don't see a lot of fish in it. Are their shoots shorter? Are they less dense? In terms of health and an idea of like long-term persistence too, there are other ways you can do sediment sampling to look for carbon sequestration in the in-funnel communities in and around eelgrass root systems. So there's definitely other ways that we do hope to look into at some point. But with the exploratory nature of, there seems to be a lot of eelgrass beds that either are or were out there. And so presence absence is like our first, cut at trying to get a nice sense of what's out there.
Okay, Araceli Dominguez. Hi, Araceli. Is there a way to know if eelgrass was abundant at one time in a certain location that currently doesn't have eelgrass?
Yes, we have seen, based on the Channel Islands research program's long-term monitoring that lasted for about 25 years, that started in the early 80s. There are records and observations and descriptions of eelgrass beds that we've tried to recontact since, preliminarily through drop camera work and some targeted scuba surveys. And that's not to say that we've comprehensively looked and they're definitely not there. It means more, we need a bigger search effort to confirm whether or not that eelgrass bed is there or not. So we do have at least some record of some of the larger persistent beds that were monitored by that program. And that's why we also want to engage the community too. There's a lot of people that have been out there for decades fishing. They're, tourism operators that have an idea and a sense of, that sense of place and where eelgrass is and isn't, or if it's changing. So we really hope to not only tap data sources like satellite imagery and previous monitoring programs, but also bring in local knowledge holders to learn from them and their experiences over the past, for as long as they've been involved with the sanctuary.
Great, got a couple more here. Both of these are from Tamara Mason. She says, in the past few weeks, I've noticed actually masses of seagrass at Huntington Beach, State Beach. I do not know if the species or why this happens. Is this a seasonal event? Does this happen in the marine sanctuary too, even without beach landing of the detached seagrass?
Yeah, we definitely see wrack. Just like kelp washes up on shore, eelgrass will do that too. We'll often find when we're getting close to eelgrass beds, or if we're trying to figure out, we're scouting, is there eelgrass here or not? There's a pretty good indicator if some is floating along the surface that there might be some nearby. And the bigger the beds, the greater density and abundance of the surface of eelgrass shoots that have become dislodged. And that happens, if they're growing and a big storm event comes through, some of it will get ripped up, and that's totally natural. And that's part of the seasonality differences, lots of extreme weather events versus like calmer summer times. For example, maybe even if there was a lot of water movement with the earthquake that happened off of Russia, I had someone talk to me about how they saw a bunch of eelgrass wash up ashore, which makes sense if there's a lot of water movement that doesn't typically come through. That would be something that they weren't prepared for or adapted for, couldn't withstand. And so, yeah, storms, there's just natural senescence and predation. So if there's something digging around in the sediment and then some of them get snapped off, or if it's like an anchoring event, for example, that will also cause eelgrass shoots to break off, float to the surface, and wash ashore. The amount, I think, depends on the season and maybe some other environmental factors could come into play with the amount.
Okay. Tamara also asks, what eats the seagrass in the marine sanctuary? In Florida, manatees eat eelgrass. Is there an animal here that depends on seagrass for survival?
Ooh. For sole survival, other than perhaps maybe some smaller invertebrates like the sea slugs that can only live on eelgrass, I don't think that there's like a larger trophic level predator that only feeds on eelgrass to survive. Every now and then, with warm water eddies coming up from the south, we have seen sea turtles in the sanctuary, and they're known to eat eelgrass and have been observed eating eelgrass in the sanctuary and off Catalina. But I don't think they only eat that to survive. I'm not as familiar. Nothing similar to manatees though in Florida, sadly.
Okay. Well, we've got to cut it off at that. There were a couple more questions. There's a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of comments about how much everyone enjoyed the presentation and your slides. Sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but we need to go. So thank you very much, Lizzie. It was a wonderful presentation. We all enjoyed it greatly. Very informative and very neat. Thank you.